Hello everyone and welcome to the Centre of Islamic Studies seminar at the University of Cambridge. I know many of you. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm acting as the interim director of the centre for this year. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the final seminar in the term. And in particular, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sarah Tobin from the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen in Norway. Dr. Tobin is an anthropologist focusing on Islam, economic anthropology, and displacement and migration in the Middle East and East Africa. And her work looks in particular at transformations in religious and economic life, identity construction, and personal piety. And her previous ethnographic work has looked in particular at Islamic piety in the economy, especially Islamic banking and finance. And I recommend in particular her monograph on Islamic banking and piety in Jordan, which is entitled Everyday Piety, Islam and Economy in Jordan, which is published with Cornell University Press, and which we teach here in the department, both undergrads and grads. Another noted work of hers is her edited collection, The Politics of the Headscarf in the United States. And here she explores the intersections between gender, Islamic authority and normativity, and public ethics. And her current work looks at these questions among Syrian refugees in the Jordanian camps of Zaatari, Azraq, and Cyber City. So we're delighted to welcome you here, Sarah. And Dr. Tobin's talk is entitled Self-Making in Exile, Moral Emplacement by Syrian Refugee Women in Jordan. And as usual, we'll have a talk for around 3/4 of an hour and then some time for questions and responses after that. So thanks very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the very generous introduction. Thank you to the Center of Islamic Studies as well for the wonderful invitation. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thanks to Neil for coordinating and hosting and for the technical expertise. Although at this point, I think we're all becoming Zoom experts, if you will. But I am going to share a screen and share my, just a general PowerPoint with you as I read through my presentation. So a little bit about me. As Paul indicated, I am a research professor at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway. My recent publications are the two books that are on the right, the monograph on the upper right, and then the co-authored volume below. And then some of my recent work includes a chapter in the new Routledge Handbook of Islam and Gender, as well as a project on Syrian refugees in Sudan. So I've published a piece last year with the POMEPS project. I've published a small piece this year on Islamic neoliberalism for Jordan's Islamic Action Front in politics and religion as well. So these are some of my recent publications. The projects that I'm working on do span quite a variety of places. However, they all tend to focus these days on Syrian refugees. So I'm on a Horizon 2020 project called Traffic, where I'm leading the efforts to research questions of mobility and transnationalism amongst Syrian refugees in the case of urban Jordan, partnering with Yarmouk University there. I have two Norwegian Norwegian Research Council, NFR, grants that I'm working on as well. In both of those, my work takes place in Jordan. And then the Arus project, which is assisting regional universities in Sudan. And under this project, I'm working with faculty at regional universities to enhance research capacities and projects, and at the same time conducting the research that I've been doing there with Syrian refugees in Sudan. I have another piece on that, but will also be forthcoming within the next week or two. Today I'm going to talk about another piece that I have forthcoming in the Journal of Religious Ethics, entitled Self-Making in Exile, Moral Emplacement by Syrian Refugee Women in Jordan. And I'm going to take about half of the ethnographic information as well as sort of the full theoretical argument to you today. I really look forward to hearing your questions and comments. And also, I'm so thrilled that there are so many familiar names in the participants list. This is a real joy for me, so thank you all really, truly for coming. So I'm going to read, but I'll try to sort of perk up a bit from time to time and interject some thoughts as well along the way. I met Fatima in the northern Jordanian city of Mafraq while conducting fieldwork with Syrian refugees. We were sitting in the office of a local NGO that provided services to Syrian women, which was small and sparsely furnished with plastic chairs and tables and Islamic calligraphy on the walls proclaiming the Shahada. Fatima is a woman in her early 30s who wears an abaya and niqab and covers her hands with black gloves. Fatima speaks quietly but confidently, nodding her head and blinking her eyes in a posture of active engagement in our conversation. The weather is quite warm, it's June, and the room does not have any air conditioning, but a slow-moving ceiling fan attempts to circulate the dry desert air around. Yet Fatima is unmoved by any physical discomfort. She appears at home and relaxed and seems to be enjoying our conversation. Fatima discusses with me how her religious life has changed once she was displaced from Syria and became a refugee in Jordan. She said, I came to Mafraq 5 years ago. Back in Syria, the religious centers, well, we used to say that the walls have ears. There was no red line, and anything that we said could turn us into criminals. I avoided any possibility of this. I avoided the religious centers. I learned everything I could about Islam here. I went to a religious center and I learned everything that I could. I wasn't afraid. Here we're free. I memorized the Quran. I started wearing niqab, and now I'm a teacher. I work in the center teaching Quran and life skills, and I teach children's classes too. Fatima then takes a moment to reflect on the content of the messages of Islam that she hears and now teaches in Jordan. She said, yes, Jordan is much more religious than Syria. I know the Jordanian government is worried about extremism. Many Daesh or ISIS fighters are said to come from here. Fatima waves her hand around to indicate here is a highly localized reference to the area we're in, here. Fatima continues, so we hear a lot of messages about moderation in Islam from the Jordanian government, but that's okay for me. I support that message. It's what I believe in. I saw enough religious violence in Syria for one lifetime. As Fatima reveals, Jordan provides many new opportunities to engage openly in cultivating her Islamic practice in a way that aligns with her own and emergent ideas and experiences with Islam. At the same time, Fatima goes on to discuss how her conditions in Jordan have also prompted her to find new forms of spiritual guidance and relief than she had in Syria. In particular, she says she now turns to the story of Maryam, the mother of Jesus, for solace, sort of fitting at the time of Christmas, thinking about this. In the Qur'anic story, Maryam was born in Jerusalem into a family of priests. Islamic sources are generally in agreement that Maryam was quickly identified as a particularly special girl. She received a message from the angel Gabriel that Allah had chosen, purified, and preferred her above all women. She was divinely appointed to conceive miraculously a chosen son named Jesus or Isa. Maryam asks how she can conceive when no man has touched her, which is an indictment of her purity and an accusation of an act of adultery. To this, the angel Gabriel reassures her that all things are easy for God, and Jesus' birth is a sign for all humanity. Fatima especially likes reflecting on this story of Maryam because, quote, it reminds me to be strong when being wrongly accused of something. Syrians are blamed for everything bad in Jordan now. Sometimes people are unkind to us or they don't trust us, but Maryam reminds me to persevere in the face of injustice, end quote. As the case of Fatima also reveals, life as a displaced Syrian woman in Jordan contains new possibilities for Islamic self-making. Displacement here is not a condition that merely destroys and tears down. Rather, displacement of both material conditions and the personal and moral experience of such suffering is a facilitating event that structures new opportunities for moral responsibility and action. As Cheryl Mattingly writes from her 2014 volume, which I reference actually quite a bit in this work, quote, suffering can engender new or intensified moral responsibilities. These too may demand a transformative effort to reimagine not only what will happen, but also what ought to happen, or how one ought to respond, not only to difficulties and suffering, but also to unexpected possibilities. I use moral rather than ethical here as a means to acknowledge Bernard Williams' distinction, that ethics answers the question, how shall I live, while moral constitutes a system of rules and obligations usually thought of in quasi-juridical terms. This is usually seen as a constraining force. This is due to the importance of everyday norms and requirements for Syrian women in Jordan, which are largely constraining. These moral responsibilities now include reimagining Islamic engagement within the context of the new host state. Fatima takes on her newfound interests, abilities, responsibilities, and opportunities in Jordan to engage her religious life, as well as newly felt obligations to be strong and to persevere due to her displacement. Fatima is engaging in Islamic self-making processes that place herself on and engage with the Islamic landscape of Jordan. So in the article, the larger article, but also in this presentation, I argue that Syrian women in Jordan engage in this Islamic self-making as part of wider emplacement practices. They live their daily lives operating more publicly in the material world through Islamically inspired actions and rituals than they did in Syria. In other words, Syrian women reported occupying a larger public and Islamic space in Jordan than in Syria. To better understand the Islamic self-processes at play, I turn to the idea of emplacement as a useful theoretical frame. As Glick, Schiller, and Chawlar describe, actions of emplacement are social processes through which a dispossessed individual builds or rebuilds networks of connection within the constraints and opportunities of the host community. Emplacement helps Syrians navigate space, place, and power in a new context. Processes of emplacement bring together both refugees and host community members who build their social belonging. Thus, the Syrian refugee women are placing themselves on Jordan's map, physically, geographically, and demographically, as well as socially, culturally, too. As the case of Fatima demonstrates, Syrian refugee women are engaging their processes of emplacement in the moral spheres. Emplacement is a useful theoretical tool to understand the ways by which displaced persons build and rebuild moral connections in these new communities. Islamic emplacement processes are thus the means by which Syrian refugee women make sense of Jordan, which they now inhabit, and they constitute an important and relatively unexplored process for self-making. Trying out new moral selves in new environs is morally uncertain and thus, if you will, experimental. In this way, the anthropology of ethics can be brought to bear on forced migration because, as Cheryl Mattingly indicates, experiences generated in moral laboratories, titled her book, serve as experiments in unfolding lives, giving them a temporal depth that is so integral to any analysis of moral becoming. Not only do displaced persons' actions occur in histories, communities, and memories, but they also launch the actor into the future through hopes and aspirations. The temporal depth at play for displaced persons is particularly acute as the violence, trauma, and suffering experienced in displacement, and most especially in the Syrian context, is an assault that forces adaptation, a problem that needs solutions, not necessarily long-term solutions, but ways for a sufferer to get through the everyday batterings that undermine his or her horizons. Emplacement is also part of the attempts by displaced persons to craft new moral, and in this case, Islamic selves, in and within new political environs and curb the hardship of their displacement. Such processes are discursive, always becoming, and constitute a method of moral self-making that establishes one's rightful place. And the Syrian refugee women are using Islamic frameworks to do so. My point of departure from some previous studies in this area is to emphasize the role of the state in providing the parameters around which the actors are adapting themselves in Islamic self-making. States play a major role in the ways by which actors must adapt themselves, including the Syrian and Jordanian states. Therefore, we must look at the ways in which the states each structure the patterns of Islamic possibilities and potentialities, as well as the desired outcomes for Islamic self-making. Such structures do not determine the pathways in self-making, and as the interlocutors themselves reveal, actors are keenly aware of both the processes and the Islamic content in play. The changing of state administrations, their police, and other governance structures such as UNHCR and NGOs not only ask or invite human actors in displacement to govern themselves, but in fact require that they do so as part of living in their new states of vulnerability. As I and others have written elsewhere, Syrian refugees in Jordan have often described feeling strongly the pressures and expectations of and for their active engagement in everyday life as refugees, though they're often struggling to discern what exactly that means and looks like in these shifting contexts. In their conditions as displaced persons, they are self-reflective as ethical actors, often comparing and contrasting their past with their present and their aspiring futures, the policies and procedures of states and entities that govern them, and questioning how to engage in the good life in the midst of such uncertainty. Within the relative structures of the Syrian and Jordanian states, we find that Syrian women are knowingly engaging in acts that alter their Islamic selves. Within the state structures, they're engaging in what James Laidlaw, in this work, The Subjective Virtue, conceives of as the process of becoming responsible for one's character. In these processes, actors become responsible, quote, to the extent that we selectively identify with some of our attitudes and dispositions more or less wholeheartedly, and in that sense make them our own. A self that is to a significant degree self-constituting and self-responsible is, on this reading, to that extent, free. This freedom to become responsible is reflective, and as Laidlaw asserts, is a precondition for moral life in general. In other words, Syrian refugee women's actions in Jordan are not overdetermined by the state, but the women are also not radically free of the structures of the relative states in which their lives are playing out. Their cultivation of attitudes and dispositions are selected from within the structural matrix. James Laidlaw pits freedom against invoking the social or the ideological state apparatus or the global system or neoliberalism, colonialist discourse, or whatever can be supposed directly or straightforwardly to explain why people do one thing rather than another. However, to invoke the state here as one aspect of an explanation is not necessarily in contradiction with his ideas. This is because, as Joel Robbins has pointed out, a strict adherence to consequentialism, or the assumption that the probable consequence of an actor appears relatively easy to gauge with certainty, is only feasible when stability, and especially political stability, renders the outcomes of moral action predictable. Displacement is defined, however, by uncertainty, and the transition of Syrian refugee women from everyday life in one political milieu to another is, I argue, not simply a transition from one explanatory force to another, but rather a generative event that brings Syrian women into new conditions of reflective freedoms by nature of the transition itself. While Syrians were, as to be expected, engaging in Islamic self-making in Syria prior to the war, the conditions of displacement and the move to Jordan thusly alter the landscapes for possibilities and potential. States offer certain objectives and parameters for Islamic practice within its borders. However, it's not a totalizing or overdetermined project. Political context is therefore necessary to set the stage on which Syrian refugee women exercise reflective freedom. So perhaps if you're not super familiar with the socio-religio-political histories of Syria and Jordan, this will be the shortest wrap-up of 20th century history you might have ever encountered. Apologies for glossing major political events, major religious events, and major social events here in this section. It is a bit longer in the paper. And I acknowledge I'm leaving out a number of important details, but I'm trying to tailor the discussion in the way towards this theoretical framework and the ethnographic data. So as I've discussed elsewhere, as have others, the last 4 decades have seen a veneer of socialist secularism that has helped raise Syrian President al-Assad's kleptocracy. Syria's Shia Alawi community, which includes al-Assad, constitutes approximately 10 to 15% of the total pre-war population, and they have experienced a profound reversal of fortunes in living memory. When the Ba'ath Party came to power in 1963, political power shifted from the majority Sunni Muslim elites to a largely rural military elite dominated by the Alawis. Elite Sunnis were displaced from high-ranking positions in Damascus and Aleppo, and they were forced to conduct business with those Alawis who only a few years earlier had served as household workers from coastal areas. As Krista Salamandra has written, a cold peace ensued, anchored by shared interest, but laced with mutual resentment. Alawis resented the Damascenes, or the Sunni merchant elites, and the Damascenes resented Alawi control of licensing and smuggling. Those excluded from both of these groups, which constitutes a large majority of people, including Christians, secularists, those from other minority sects, and many poor and rural Sunnis, resented them both. The Alawis became synonymous with connections to power, military, and foreign relations, and the Sunni elites became synonymous with profiteering and reinforcing the status quo. While the Ba'ath Party's stated project was to rid Syria of subnational distinctions, the authoritarian Assad regime enacted policies that in fact exacerbated them. Sectarian relations were cool with a social agreement underlying agnostic relations. For most Syrians, this meant that everyday life was characterized by state-led oppression in political and religious life. Sunnis were almost totally excluded from the highest political institutions in the army, political prisoners were detained without trial, and the ever-present threat of imprisonment due to the extensive surveillance of the secret police, or mukhabarat, was everywhere. There were strict restrictions on opposition activities in the media, including permitting the operations of only 3 highly censored newspapers in the country, limiting the spread of satellite TV, and censorship of all Islamic media. Despite an ancient history of Islamic flourishment in Syria during the Umayyad and the Abbasid eras, religious activities that were deemed oppositional to the Assad regime, including participating in the Muslim Brotherhood, can mean imprisonment or worse. This was demonstrated perhaps most acutely in the massacre of Hama in 1982, during which 40,000 people were killed, 15,000 imprisoned, and over 100,000 displaced. Due to longstanding restrictions on Islamic associations, those that were permitted by the state to operate had limited geographic areas of operation and underdeveloped administrative structures and human resources that provided for basic religious lessons, general spiritual guidance, and emergency food and supplies for families in the neighborhood. Unlike Islamic charitable activities in the region, in the larger region, including Jordan, those in Syria were not allowed to scale up their operations to include Islamic schools or hospitals. Mosques were led by and co-opted from pro-regime leaders, and the Assad regime even went so far as to propose a ban for mosques on food provision and fast breaking in public during Ramadan. By contrast, Jordan is much more ethnically and religiously homogeneous, with the predominant cleavage in society falling along Palestinian and Jordanian ethnic lines rather than religious. Nearly 90% of the country are Sunni Muslims. It's described by many as non-sectarian. When discussing the vulnerabilities of Jordan to sectarian divisions, King Abdullah has said, this is actually one of the greatest quotes I think that he's ever said, because it's factually so false. So quote, "We are the least vulnerable to the risk of sectarian divisions and tensions due to the homogeneous makeup of Jordanian society, and thank God for that, alhamdulillah, and the historical process of building a collective national identity. These elements have guaranteed that we never slipped into sectarian or ethnic conflicts throughout our history." So questions of the historical accuracy of the statement aside, Black September, of course, being the civil conflict between Palestinian and Jordanians fought in the early 70s. The Hashemite monarchy has attempted to sustain legitimacy by emphasizing the king's genealogical descent from the guardianship of the holy places, as well as his contemporary commitment to the welfare of the populace. King Abdullah, the Hashemite ruling family asserts, embodies both an inheritance and a benevolence. This highly individualized construction of monarchical power obscures both the monarchy's debt to British colonial powers in establishing its rule and the fact that, as a unified entity, Jordan has no historical memory before the 20th century. The shallow state-sponsored historical nationalist narratives of tribe and natal geography and contemporary references of unity have resonated with less than half of the population who identify as ethnic Jordanians. Thus, the Jordanian government is now heavily involved in the development of state-sponsored religious institutions in order to retain a national audience. In particular, the Jordanian government has officially endorsed and provided institutional support for intra-Islamic cooperation and mutual recognition of a wide variety of sects through the Amman message, which is a statement of Orthodox inclusion for Sunnis and Shias, as well as Ibadis, Tahiris, Ashari Muslims, and also Sufis and Salafists. The state vision for Islam fits in with its nation-building project, such as celebrating religious ceremonies, hospitality, loyalty, and honor. The project's long-standing, and it builds upon a monitoring and control of religious public spaces, religious education, and preaching in mosques. Religious life falls under the purview of Wizarat al-Awqaf, the Ministry of Religious Endowments and Holy Places, including mosques, preachers, and religious functionaries. This comes from a 1986 edict declaring state control and monitoring of religious instruction and preaching. The Amman message is but one aspect of the Jordanian national brand of Islam, which aims for moderation, inclusion, and harmony above all else. As Fida Adeli has pointed out, there are a number of competing projects that seek to define Islamic orthodoxy in Jordan today. An Islamic revival has spanned more than 30 years, and the power to define and monitor religious knowledge has been at the center of political and religious struggles throughout the region, including Syria and Jordan, often pitting the pious citizens between them. The Jordanian government has a tense but relatively non-violent relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood and its political arm, the Islamic Action Front. In fact, the IAF was allowed to openly operate and flourish for 30 years, while political parties were otherwise banned and leftist groups were suppressed, which enabled the organization to build an impressive institutional base. There are a wide variety of public and private social and pedagogical institutes with religious mandates in Jordan, where residents can learn about Islam and Islamic teachings, as well as seek moral guidance. A wide array of Islamic media proliferates, including radio stations and print media. The Islamic Center Society, which came under governmental control in 2006, implements brotherhood activities, including premarital counseling, sex education, and funds for mass weddings. In fact, Jeffrey Hughes, who's an anthropologist at the University of Exeter, has a monograph forthcoming on this very topic. Highly recommended. Really, it's a brilliant research project, a brilliant work, and what he's published even so far on the topic is really excellent ethnography. Highly recommended. Further, the Jordanian public education system includes a religion class, which is required of all Muslim students from 1st through 12th grades. There's a vibrant community of Sufis in Amman, which are predominantly foreign-born Muslims that study there under a local sheikh. Though by contrast, Jordan supports a more vibrant and open religio-social life for its residents than Syria, it is still subject to state approval of the messaging. Generally speaking, as long as the messages of these actors cohere with the state-sponsored vision of the Amman message, they're permitted to continue. The Hashemite monarchy is still guided by an interest in maintaining controls over religious education and learning, messaging, and action for fear of instability. For those within its borders who are interested in pursuing an Islam that aligns with the tenets of the Amman message and in projects of Islamic self-making that conform to that of the Jordanian state, the environment is rich with possibilities and potential. Interviews with Syrian women that I conducted in urban Jordan reveal much about the processes of emplacement and shows the ways in which they engage in larger public and Islamic spaces in Jordan than they did in Syria. I conducted 2 focus group discussions and interviews in the northern Jordanian cities of Mafraq and Irbid. This is the most sort of heavily Syrian sort of concentrated area in the north next to the Syrian border. Mafraq is a Jordanian city approximately 15 kilometers from the border. Pre-Syrian crisis or civil war, the city was a small border town of 90,000 people with strong pro-Jordanian national sentiments that one could stop in for a quick coffee or gasoline fill-up while en route to the Syrian border and onwards to Damascus or points beyond. Mafraq was one of the earliest sites for Syrian refugees to congregate in Jordan, given its proximity to southern Syria, where the anti-regime demonstrations were quickly and violently repressed. Mafraq is now home to over 200,000 people, many or most of whom are Syrians, and it's known for urban crowding. It's also 15 kilometers away from Zaatari, which is the world's largest Syrian refugee camp. Irbid was the second site for focus group discussions and interviews that I conducted. Prior to the influx of Syrian refugees, Irbid was the second largest urban area in the country after the capital city of Amman, and was well known for urban crowding and a large number of institutions for higher education. Now approximately 30% of the country's Syrians live in Irbid. So despite these 2 different urban settings, the Syrian women I interviewed had common elements that they described in their religious trajectories. Most especially, they all described how the physical space, material life, and sociocultural emphasis on Islamic piety in their new Jordanian communities had served to enhance the possibilities for and access to growing their own religious practice. These conditions also facilitated their interest in and desire for their own Islamic self-making in Jordanian context-specific ways. especially by engaging their freedom to attend classes for Quranic recitation and in the social practices of religious learning as a means to curb vulnerabilities. Nearly all of the women said they rarely had attended formal religious classes or gatherings in Syria, and if they had, they would have only done so for 1 hour per week in someone's home, maybe 2 maximum. However, these practices were fraught and fear-inducing, and they could result in arrest. The women reported that the Syrian secret police, the Mukhabarat, and state surveillance, along with fears of imprisonment, made the women I interviewed afraid of being seen as too religious in Syria, or even to engage socially on matters of religious life. One woman who had attended some classes in Syria said, quote, "We used to attend Quranic recitation sessions cautiously. There was no religious freedom, so we had to practice at home so as not to be the target of official intelligence reports." End quote. Nearly all of the women I spoke with indicated that they did not discuss religion with others. One added, "We were afraid to do this." Beyond fear, one woman even reported feeling ashamed of wanting to learn more about Islam in Syria. Another woman went into detail. Quote, "As for religious life in Syria, it was really difficult. We used to attend religious sessions in mosques, but under surveillance. We also used to make these sessions at home, but again under surveillance of the Syrian government. Also, the material was limited, and the books were also specific. Some were even completely banned. Those allowed were under surveillance. When we came here to Jordan, we found that there were a lot of mistakes in those books, and probably the information had been perverted knowingly. All in all, the situation in Jordan is far better than that of Syria." End quote. Another woman added, "In Jordan, it's far more secure to learn about religion. Unlike in Syria, here you can go with no fear and no worries." And another one said, "Here in Jordan, there is far more freedom. One feels that she's not under surveillance." So all the women indicated in particular that they have more freedom to practice religion in Jordan. It's useful to unpack the idea of freedom that the women are referencing here. Freedom here, the women said, was not only a negative freedom, where the Jordanian government refrained from exerting significant external constraints, but also a positive freedom that gave the women the power, opportunity, and resources to fulfill their desires for Islamic learning. Syrian refugee women understood and articulated the freedom both in terms of material support, as there are more centers, classes, books, and learning materials in Jordan, and in terms of assistance or classes dedicated to memorizing the Quran specifically, which was often cited as a particularly desirable way to engage in Islamic self-making in Jordan. By contrast, classes for Quranic memorization in Syria were reported as frequently banned or difficult to access for these women. Quranic memorization in these classes falls within the Jordanian state messages of Islam, as the staff are government employees. The government often hosts contests and competitions in Quranic memorization and recitation. State-sponsored access is vital in processes of emplacement. The women all reported that in Jordan they had the channels and opportunities to engage this way, and that the state's freedoms made it possible. So it's interesting to note that Quranic recitation and memorization was considered both a political act and an emplacement practice in Islamic self-making. While the practice was deemed highly controversial and potentially criminal in Syria, it was elevated as a preferred practice in Jordan and facilitated by the state, according to these women. This is because the Hashemite monarchy proclaimed political legitimacy and religious authority as descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. They are the keepers of Islam in Jordan. Religious life is expected as long as it conforms to their understandings of its contours. Al-Assad, by contrast, promoted a secular regime. Claims to religious authority in Syria, especially Islamic religious authority, were viewed as threats against their authority. Learning and knowing the Quranic text provides actors with Islamic authority, which is thus reinforcing the political authority in Jordan and threatening in the other. Furthermore, Quranic recitation is an integral part of learning to be human and Muslim, according to Dale Eichelman. Quranic memorization and recitation is one example of an emplacement practice that is central to the moral and ethical practices throughout the region. So Charles Hirschkin, for example, has written about this extensively in the case of Egypt. And in no small part because it makes the actor a better listener, a better and more open and engaging actor to the messages of Quran and the religious leaders' sermons. Quranic memorization is a fundamental bedrock to Islamic self-cultivation, not only for these Syrian women, but beyond. Some Syrian women reported feeling like they were learning about Islam for the first time in Jordan and were doing so in social and familial groups. One woman says, "In Dara, Syria, I never attended religious teaching classes either at home or anywhere else. In Jordan, I have started learning about religion with my neighbors." Most of the women indicated that they attend religious classes and visit centers for learning multiple times a week and do so with their children, especially their daughters, that they can enter and participate freely as a family. One said, quote, "When we came to Jordan, we didn't have any fear. We can walk openly and without shame to learn our religion," end quote. Centers for Islamic learning and Qur'anic memorization in Jordan are similar to other centers for religious study as some of the few spaces in the greater Middle East in which women are able to meet in social settings outside of the home. So Warner discusses this in from 1993, but I think that it still holds true, that a religious space is sort of deemed a safe space for women to gather, and especially in more conservative neighborhoods. This is desirable for cultivating personal strength and empowerment within the family. According to another participant, the religious upbringing in Syria depended on the parents. In Jordan, though, we have a whole community that you can talk to and learn from, said one. In contexts where women are the primary adherents to Islamic norms of conduct, they can feel more responsible for the behaviors of their children and their family's social and religious identity. And they may fear that displacement will prompt a sense of loss, both cultural and religious. As one woman added, "We were good Muslims in Syria before we came to Jordan, as good as we could be anyway. But becoming refugees here has made us more patient and more religious, and part of a stronger community that helps each other out and teaches each other to live in the way of Islam." Another woman added, "We were forced to suppress our religion in Syria. This is why our religious life there was so different from now." So in addition to feelings of freedom to explore and practice Islam more openly, the women also indicated that they did it out of protection, not from the police, as was the case of Syria, but rather from the evils and dangers in society. They indicated they could now and should now pursue living on the right path. This aversion to moral danger and conditions of exile is often part of the migration experience. As one woman said, "It's like my eyes have been opened. Now I know, so I have to do the right things. We have more opportunities to learn about Islam here, but also more responsibility to live rightly." Another added, "We were encouraged to go to centers in Jordan because other Syrian women felt more aware here and conscious of Allah and of themselves. They felt the need to protect themselves, so we did too. Then you feel the need to protect your children by choosing the right path." So the social dynamics become really key here. Many women I interviewed indicated that they did not wear the hijab in Syria, but they do so in Jordan. Some reported doing so because most Jordanian women do. A few indicated that they do so because they learned that, quote, "a woman's body is sacred and seductive." Some women during a focus group that I had conducted debated the face covering, the niqab, during the focus group, and it was a very fascinating discussion. One woman hinted at the idea that society is not safe enough for them to go without the niqab. She says, quote, "We live in a different age than the time of the Quran, and it's not necessarily required, but the way that people are now implies that we should wear it. I know it's not mentioned specifically, but this is the conclusion that some of us have come to based on our knowledge in our new context." So moral vulnerability for the Syrian refugee women in Jordan is curbed in ways that also protect against their physical and social vulnerabilities. Moral vulnerabilities, as in the case of Fatima at the beginning, or the refugee women here are described above, are pursuing Islamic self-making as a means to live rightly. And while the new context is largely defined as that of Jordan, some women also viewed their Islamic context as temporal and different from, but inspired by, and consonant with that of the Prophet Muhammad and the revelation of the Quran. This demonstrates that emplacement projects here are acts of moral responsibility as understood within Laidlaw's reflective freedom framework. These processes of Islamic self-making also protect against physical and social vulnerability. Wearing the hijab or niqab can be conceived of as protection against those vulnerabilities socially and physically, which also can help curb moral vulnerability. Donning the hijab is rarely singularly motivated in these spheres. Attending Islamic classes and centers with neighbors and children is a protection against vulnerability. Women traveling in groups is a key method of protecting against physical vulnerabilities, for example, and it also protects against social isolationism and alienation. By including children in these actions, one can argue that these emplacement acts are also protecting moral futures against vulnerability. As Cheryl Mattingly indicates, the temporal depth is so integral to any analysis of moral becoming and includes not only references to an Islamic past, but also references and acts that protect a future. So this article It serves to bring an anthropology of ethics to bear on migration and refugees in the case of Syrians in Jordan. The women engaged in processes of Islamic self-making as part of their larger emplacement practices in the physical, social, and moral landscapes of Jordan. The processes that are shared amongst them are in the pursuit of an Islamic self that is self-constituting and self-responsible. To this degree, they are reflectively free, morally speaking, even as they may feel confined in a new material world and state context that they did not choose. Acts of physical movement, embodied speech through Qur'anic memorization, and engaging in lessons of religious narrative serves to do much of the work of Islamic self-making for these Syrian refugee women in Jordan. The anthropology of ethics also applies here because processes of emplacement in Islamic self-making constitute a kind of ground project. Such a project is mutually constitutive relationship between the self and one's moral undertaking. It's so deep and central to one's identity that to lose it might prompt one to not care to go on with their lives, or would not know themselves if they no longer had them. When Syrian refugee women are presented with a new possibility for Islamic self-making, one that many felt they had been denied in Syria, the self becomes a new kind of Islamic self. And this new Islamic self is constituted within the material and governance context of a new host state that sets the parameters and terms for such moral projects. Thus, the state context matters tremendously. These processes are not overdetermined by important state policies, but the women are not radically free to pursue their specific forms of Islamic self-making either. The contours, including these classes, enhanced public and social pious formations, and narrating the Quranic stories, importantly, are presented through state-authorized channels. These possibilities and their desirability vary from urban to encamped setting and beyond. Even within a singular state, there was diversity in the authorized practices available. Thus, not all Syrian refugee women are able to or necessarily interested in pursuing the same Islamic self. For the Syrian women in Jordan, the politicalness of their actions is channeled through Jordanian state-approved and sponsored projects. So their actions are reinforcing the messages of the state. They are not undermining or challenging the state's authority, as such actions were seen to do in Syria. Should the kinds of Islamic selves they make become constituted through processes or methods that are not state-approved, the dynamic at play here would certainly change. However, the real test is for Syrian refugee women to continue to pursue emplacement practices when their status changes again. The shifting relationship between Syrians and Jordan and the state is sure to alter the contours of possibility and desire for these Islamic selves once more. So thank you very much. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. So thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Sarah, for a really fascinating account of emplacement and sort of discussion of emplacement in this context. It's really satisfying paper.